And good afternoon, and welcome, and all of that. I'm a little late online, but I was busy having a conversation, which is the story of my life. I spend my life having conversations. What do you do for a living, Alan? I have conversations. That's basic, and I read. Anyway, welcome to everybody who's out there. I hope people are out there, and welcome to those of you who watch on our YouTube channel. And I do remind everybody not to merely watch on our YouTube channel, but to subscribe to our YouTube channel, because it makes a lot of difference in terms of what we get back out of YouTube. So if you're already watching, do subscribe to our channel, and also subscribe to our Facebook page. And we're out on Instagram, and we will be broadening our social media outreach over the next while. In fact, our much vaunted and much promised update of our website is happening very, very soon now. So we're becoming much more technologically savvy, and you'll get much more information from us, whether you like it or not. So how are we doing? It's now 2:00. There's Shelley. Hello, Shelley. And James. Hello. Spring is definitely on the way. It is a glorious spring day here in certainly in Regent Square, and I imagine all over Pittsburgh. The snow has melted away. Thank heavens. Hello, David. And if it's Jamie one, welcome. And there's Grace, always there. Bless you, Grace. As I say, the snow has melted away. It's a lovely, warm day. I sat out on my back deck drinking coffee this morning as if it was May. Of course, it'll all change because they're threatening snow again in a couple of days' time. But we can dream, can't we? I hope wherever you are in the world, it's a delightful and pleasant day as it is here in Pittsburgh. Please. Well, first of all, thank you all our patrons who have supported us so far for our 2022 web series. We can now formally ask if you wish to sponsor a webinar. If you want to sponsor one of these programs, you can do so. The cost is $250. If you're interested in doing that, please send us an email. We would be delighted to hear from you. But don't forget, every single donation matters. I say it every week, and I will continue to say it. Every single dollar helps. And it is the donation dollars that actually put on the productions. It's the donation dollars that feed us for PICT Educates, for such things as the webinars and the Expand the Canon series and all the other programs. We're going to be introducing an apprenticeship scheme. All of that, we need your dollars. No matter how small that donation is, it really does help. And you don't just have to donate in dollars. Wherever you are in the world, if you want to send us something, we'll convert it. And thank you so much for even thinking about doing it. But thinking is not quite as good as doing. So please just think about it today. Send a few dollars. It all helps. So it's now, people should have lined up, and if they're late, they're late. We are still on a cycle of talking about the Greeks, and the sort of subtitle for today is the line that is always misquoted from Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. We always say it's all Greek to me. In fact, the line is it's Greek to me. But everybody believes that they can improve on Shakespeare, so be it. Why do I say it's all Greek to me? Because of a fundamental belief, and if you've been following the last 2 weeks, you'll understand where I'm coming from, that all theatre, as we know it in the Western world, and I'm very specific about that, I'm talking about theatre in the Western world, theatre from the East, theatre from China, Japan, India, comes from a somewhat different premise. And in a future webinar later in the year, I hope, we'll be talking about that that development of theatre that developed into the kind of theatre you will find, particularly in southern India, that you will find in China, and specifically the ones that are probably best known, the theatre you will find in Japan of Kabuki and No. And I want to talk about that later in the year. But everything I'm talking about in these programs is concerned about the development of Western theatre, and Western theatre developing from what we might describe as the fundamental roots of Western civilization, the Greeks. So if I tend to repeat myself, forgive me, but I tend to repeat myself anyway. I've got to that age. But also it's important to remember exactly what I'm talking about and where it came from. And again, as I've said over the last couple of weeks, it came from storytelling. The human desire to share information, to share feelings, to share beliefs, starts with the process of storytelling in one way, shape, or form. And as we said last week, the Greeks evolved a methodology for doing this. They evolved what we have come now to understand as both the action form of theatre and the physical form of theatre. So this week, as I say, because it's all Greek to me, everything comes from the Greeks, I want to look at some of the major themes that the Greek poets and playwrights addressed. And by doing that, I want to talk about 4 of the major Greek playwrights. What they did, what they addressed, and they did cover pretty much all of human behavior between them and human frailties in particular, from arrogance and hubris to love and downright absurdity, the absurdity of human behavior, and all of these overwatched by a pantheon of Olympian gods. So that marriage of poetry and religion was always a sort of a subset of the writing rules that they followed. So this week and next week, we're going to meet some of the very unfortunate humans whose lives and deaths were acted out as this demonstration of human frailty and as a lesson to us all. Some of these are mythical, some of them were actual, but essentially speaking, they were all theatrical characters. So in essence, what we're looking at is the early development of storytelling into the art of theatre through the mind of the poet. When I use the word poet and the word playwright, in this sense, they're almost interchangeable. Really what we're talking about is the person who put down the words that the actor could perform, the person who created in his imagination the nature of the character that the actor would assume. But before the actor could do that, those thoughts had to be created, had to be put down. And the writers, just like the actors, had to follow a kind of a rule book of how this was done. But as with all great art and all great artists, once you have a rule book, and once you've mastered the rule book, your next step is to break the rules. All artists do this. Everybody does this. Every creative person, anybody with an ounce of creativity in their brain, will eventually break the rules and create a new set of rules, which somebody else will come along and break in their turn. And so we have development. Without that rule breaking, nothing would develop. Rule breaking, don't say this to your kids, rule breaking is the most important part of the creative process. Traditionally, theatre, as we know it, breaks down into distinctive styles, and they're represented by the traditional theatre masks, which is the symbol of all Western theatre, the masks of comedy and tragedy. So let's start with the father of tragedy, and that, pretty much unquestionably, was Aeschylus. Now, I'm going to mention Aeschylus and three other writers. We tend to think of the Greeks, we sort of lump them together. Oh, the Greek playwrights. Well, in fact, you can sort of lump them together because they all lived in a very similar time frame. They were all aware of each other. They were all conscious of each other, but there is a kind of a time scale for them. In the 400s BC or BCE, depending on your particular preference, in that period of time, these writers were at their height. But the father of tragedy, as we actually understand it today, and a lot of this information comes from what's his name? It'll come to me. I can never remember names. A lot of the history of these writers and what we understand about them was actually written down. All of their plays were written down, but sadly, most of their plays have disappeared. I will make a small point here. I am one of those who is still angry about the burning of the Library of Alexandria by some strange queen who thought it was a good idea to burn books. And we have dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of fragments of plays by these writers, but very few complete texts. They all wrote a huge amount. What we have is simply a fraction of their creativity. What we know and understand about the art of tragedy begins to a large extent with the plays of Aeschylus. What we understand about the earlier works of other writers, which are mostly fragments, is largely based on the kind of impressions we can take from the writings of Aeschylus. Now, according to Aristotle, Aristotle, who is our source material for an awful lot of this, he was the one who proposed that it was Aeschylus who made the first major rule break in the development of the theatre form. Initially, it would be, as I said before, the poet reciting, the poet telling the story as a form of recitation. That was expanded to two. Aristotle tells us that Aeschylus actually increased the number of characters and allowed actual conflict between the characters. Prior to that, characters basically interacted with the chorus. The chorus became the storyteller, and the principal character was, as if it were the chorus was the interlocutor, and the principal character would respond to the chorus's promptings. But it was Aeschylus who introduced the idea of multiple characters, according to Aristotle. Now, we reckon he probably wrote anywhere a little short of 100 plays. Of those, we only have 7. That's all we have left. And he was also, it is generally thought, that he was the very first writer to write trilogies. The whole notion of Star Trek 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, which was originally a trilogy, strangely episodes 4, 5, and 6, started with Aristotle, the idea of taking a theme and developing it and developing it. So this notion of the trilogy really, we believe, began with Aeschylus. And following my usual dictum of everything I tell you may be wrong, when I said it is thought, we believe, we rely on Aristotle to tell us these things, that's absolutely true. Everything I tell you may be wrong. This is just sort of accepted wisdom, because nobody who was around at the time is still here to tell the tale. Now, one thing about Aeschylus was that he was writing from, a lot of his work was written from personal knowledge. He was a soldier, and he was involved in what is still regarded as one of the great and most famous battles in Greek history, and indeed in military history, because we celebrated every single Olympic Games. He was involved in the Battle of Marathon, where the Athenians were fighting off the Persians. They were always fighting off the Persians. He was also fighting again when Xerxes, those of you who've seen the movie 300 will know who Xerxes was, and he fought against them at the Battle of Salamis, which is very prominent in the play, The Persians. which was actually his oldest surviving plays, the earliest of his plays that we actually have. And it was a play that won first prize at the Festival of Dionysus, which I talked about before. This festival of the celebration of the god by the creation of a poem, which became a play, which became a spectacular experience, and from which all modern theatre is built. So, and as I say, as we've discussed this previously, all the Greek drama, all the seeds come from religious festivals, mostly Dionysus. And out of those festivals came the competitions. And the way it worked was, in these competitions, the playwright would write 3 plays, or 3, if you like, 3 tragedies and 1 satire. And that format was the rules of the writing, that you followed those rules in order to enter the competition. But the fact that he could write trilogies allowed him to explore themes of human behavior and religious behavior. He could introduce a kind of continuum. He could create a world that he could investigate the behavior of the human condition as conditions changed, as the order of things altered. In other words, as nature broke its own rules. And so you have this proposition set up. Another example is investigated from another angle. A third example is investigated from another angle. And that's the basis of the modern trilogy. No matter how complex and beautiful it may be, or how overly simplistic may be, it's still that basic principle that Aeschylus developed 2,500 years ago. Aeschylus tended to win the competitions. He won a lot. Now there are 7, as I say, 7 basic tragedies that have survived. The Persians, 7 Against Thieves, The Suppliants, the Oresteia, which is 3 plays, Agamemnon, Libation Bearers and Eumenides, and Prometheus Bound. Now, we're not absolutely certain he wrote Prometheus Bound, but it's generally accepted. All of his tragedies won first prize at the Dionysus competition. Now, the most famous of all those is unquestionably the Oresteia, which you can get in a multitude of translations. This is the story of the return of Agamemnon from the Trojan War, his murder by his wife, her murder by their daughter and son, and the begging of forgiveness of the gods, basically. It's a wonder. I mean, it's a history based on a mythology that might have been a history because we have discovered Troy. But it is also a wonderful examination of the human condition, of human behavior, given an extreme set of circumstances. What do you do when you return from war and one of the people you've brought back is your mistress? What does your wife do? Is already having an affair with your friend. She kills you. What happens when the children find out because they love their father? They kill her. What do they do now? Because fratricide and matricide have been committed, which is against all the rules. You pray to the gods for forgiveness. That's the famous trilogy of Aeschylus, and it was that first great true examination of the human condition, how the human mind behaves and how society behaves given a set of appalling circumstances. He didn't just write that. There is a possibility that he actually wrote a trilogy about Odysseus, about his return from Ithaca and the killing of the suitors, and so he took his theme from the Homeric history or great poem and examined examined Odysseus in the same way. But this is an apparent trilogy that he may have written. We don't actually have the result of it, but it is known that there were three plays: the Soul Raisers, Penelope, and the Bone Gatherers, which may have been a trilogy. Now, I want to make another point about trilogy, and I'll come to it again in a minute. They didn't just sit down and write three plays, bang, bang, bang. What we have are the remains of what they wrote. To write a trilogy, sometimes they might write three plays, bang, 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 and sometimes they might write a play and go away from it, and sometime later come back and write a second, and sometime later come back and write a third. And the next of the writers that I will refer to certainly did that. The second of the greats of the Greeks that we know about was Sophocles. Now, he started to write a little after Aeschylus and a little before Euripides, but it doesn't separate them vastly in time. They were all conscious of each other. This was the great flowering of Greek literature and Greek theater. We do know, according again to historic sources, that he wrote over 120 plays. Sophocles was incredibly prolific. We only have 7. The burning of the Library of Alexandria was a crime against humanity. 7 plays, the list of them are Ajax, Antigone, Women of Trachis, Oedipus Rex, Electra, Philoctetes, and Oedipus at Colonus. Now, I didn't use the word trilogy in there for a very precise reason. He was a hugely influential writer, celebrated as much and as successfully, wrote as successfully as Aeschylus. He was the literary god in Athens for a considerable period of time. He competed in the competitions. Records say that he competed in 30 and won 24, but was never judged worse than second place. That's the record he has. Just in terms of the scorecard, I have that one as well. Aeschylus won 13 competitions. As I say, Sophocles won 24, but Euripides, who I'll come to in a moment, just won 4 of them. They didn't like Euripides, and I'll explain why. Now, probably the most famous tragedies of Sophocles feature Oedipus and Antigone. So they become known as the Theban plays. But as far as we can tell, they were not written as a trilogy. If you buy a book like this, you'll probably see the Theban trilogy, and it will say Oedipus Rex, Oedipus at Colonus, Antigone, as if they were a continuum. But they're not. They were probably, each individual play was probably part of its own trilogy. And the only evidence we have left that he wrote them are those 3 particular plays. But each one does not necessarily correlate to the others. And indeed, there are inconsistencies between them. We call them the Theban plays because they're the only Theban plays we have from the pen of Sophocles. And they do make a fascinating trilogy in their own right, but it's not the way they were written. They were written with different associated plays. Now, Sophocles, as I say, Aeschylus broke the rules and created a new form of structure, allowing for additional characters and allowing characters to interact with each other instead of merely with the interlocutory chorus. Sophocles took it further. And he actually, he was the first one to actually add the third actor, according to some of the sources. And thereby, by adding a third actor, because if you have two people in debate, it's two people in debate. Once you introduce a third, if you try to put an equivalence, there's always a problem when there's a third person in a marriage. Once you have a third person, you have an internal conflict that isn't simply a straight A disagrees with B or B agrees with A. Suddenly, that third party changes everything. One of the best examples of that in terms of modern writers would be the play Huis Clos, or In Camera, based on the proposition that hell is other people, that eternity in a room with three people in it is hell. And that's a sort of construct that's come out of what Sophocles did by introducing that third element, that third person, into the internal debate between two others. Then you create drama. So the other important thing is that once you introduce a third person, that third person becomes by nature an interlocutor, a questioner. And that reduced the importance of the chorus. Instead of the chorus being the interrogator, the chorus was reduced to simply being a narrator or a commentator, commentating on what had happened, informing the audience of where we were or what was about to occur, but no longer directly involved in the conversation between the characters. And by that process, Sophocles actually developed the characters much more than the previous writers, and possibly including Aeschylus, although Aeschylus was pretty good at it. But this notion that a character was more than simply the words they say. If you like, he gave a kind of, he was beginning to develop this notion that actors understand of what is the background. Actors will always attempt to create through research or through imagination a backstory for characters. Sophocles, to an extent, was doing this, or at least laying the groundwork for this to happen. And it happened simply because there were more than just one or two people talking. There were three. And of course, once you had established the rule that you can have three, or once you've broken the rule and said you can have three, anything is possible. So really what we can thank Sophocles for in this is this creation or development of a dramatic structure that goes above and beyond the simple art of storytelling. Because the simple art of storytelling implies, I suppose, in a way, this is the story. This is what happened. This is what people did. But in that, nobody is standing to the side saying, why? Or, is that right? Is that true? Once you start to impose other characters into the story, you suddenly have debate. And debate is an essential aspect of drama as we now know it. He also, it is thought by most scholars, that Sophocles was the first to truly introduce what we now know as scenery. We talked about the physical form of the theatre and the scena, the background of the orchestra, where there was a constant background, and that as theatre developed, they used it more and more and more. But we believe it was Sophocles who introduced the idea of painted scenery, of creating a picture for the audience to look at in addition to the actors. So he really was quite revolutionary. And again, when it came to breaking the rules, Sophocles followed the logical path of all actors. If there's a rule and you know how to use it, break it. But his writing, his capacity to write, his capacity to create character, to my mind, and of all the Greek writers, I think Sophocles might be my favorite. He understood to a great degree the nature of human frailty. He had his own frailties. He was, as far as we understand, truly homosexual, which was not illegal but frowned upon. He understood the difficulties of life. He understood the difficulties of the dangers that life throw at you. He understood, as I say, human nature to a high degree. And when we look at a play, when we look at Oedipus Rex, for example, which Aristotle maintains was the greatest tragedy in his lifetime ever written, you are seeing a wonderful examination of a man who is not a bad person, but whom life throws every bad thing at, and how that person reacts to it. And because one is a good person, one believes that one can deal with it, and hubris enters always into the situation, and you end up destroyed. And this is why Oedipus is such a fascinating, wonderful exploration into the human condition. The other thing about Sophocles, and in modern terms, we would look upon all of these as somewhat conservative writers in political thinking. But the other thing about Sophocles was, and the phrase has been used about him in just about anything you research, fatalism. And fatalism, which is sort of, fatalism is part of again, if you do the research, you'll find this, part of the Socratic, the logic of Socrates. And fatalism is, Greek drama, Greek tragedy is riddled with this. The problem with Oedipus is that he was fatally inflicted. His destiny had been decided. It was foretellable. The Sphinx foretells it. The legend foretells it. It's all foretold. That no matter what he does, he cannot escape his destiny. And destiny is one of those dreadful words. And if anybody talks about your destiny, run a mile. Because the assumption of destiny is the assumption of predestination. And Oedipus is somebody who is destined to fail, who is destined to kill his father, destined to marry his mother incestuously and produce incestuously born children. There's nothing he can do to escape it. And when the prophecy is foretold and his parents send him away, or he runs away because he doesn't want to damage his parents, but they're not his parents, they're his adopted parents. His real parents, who were told the prophecy, left him on a hillside. And the one place he goes to hide is the one place where his real parents live. And on a road, a man comes along, an arrogant man, and they fight, and Oedipus kills him and has fulfilled the first stage of the prophecy and goes back into the city and meets the grieving queen, and they fall in love, and he marries her and has children, not knowing it is actually his mother. So destiny is an important point in a lot of these plays, and particularly in Sophocles. He is a great writer of fatalism, of the expectation that whatever you think, it'll go wrong. Whatever you try to do, you'll fail because you are destined. So this Theban trilogy we talk about, which isn't really a trilogy, but Oedipus Rex, or Oedipus Aeschylus and Antigone, are all an investigation, not simply of a legend, not simply of a king and princesses, but of the human condition and human behavior. And Antigone is one of the most remarkable because it is an investigation of defiance. It is about a young woman who says no. And of all the plays of Sophocles, I think it's been possibly the best translated because it's so easily relatable to in modern terms. And one of the best modern versions of it was by the French writer Jean Anouilh, and his version of Antigone is quite remarkable and really brings it down to the essence of what Sophocles was writing about. That you may be destined, you are destined, but you can take destiny by the throat and say, fine, if this is what's going to happen, it's going to happen in my terms. And if I'm going to die, I'm going to die doing what I believe. It's a glorious, glorious play. Anouilh translated it because at the time, France had experienced Nazi Germany, and many French said no, and it was the resistance. And so it became a symbol for French resistance, this notion of saying no to authority. So, I can take you through the plot of each of these plays. I'm not going to read them. They are wonderful. But as I say, where Oedipus Rex may be the greatest tragedy, according to Aristotle, and I think you may be right, Antigone is one of the most remarkable. This wonderful thing of your brothers are dead. The king has said one of them gets a state funeral, the other just gets left. And you say, no, I won't leave my brother to rot. I'm going to bury him. Well, if you do that, you're going to die. Then let me die. But it is her destiny. She's going to do it. But not simply is she going to die, that because of this action, the king is going to lose his wife, his son, and all because of an inability to break the rules. Your destiny is controlled by a set of rules. If you don't break those rules, you're going to follow your destiny. And very often, if you try to break those rules, destiny still catches up with you, as it did with Oedipus. So these plays are a wonderful examination of how the human brain works and of the danger of belief in fatalism, the danger of belief in predestination. And I find it deeply frustrating because, as I say, we have 7 of his plays. He wrote 120. That there were other plays out there as good, if not better, as a wonderful examination of human condition, and how much in a modern society, knowing how much our art, our politics, our thinking has been influenced by these writings, how much more we would know, how much better we would understand the human condition if those 120 plays were still around. Now, the third writer, I'm talking too much, I'm running out of time. The third writer, I'll speed up a little, Euripides, the third of them. Now, Euripides, if you like, I always like to think of Euripides as the angry young man of these two, where these two were the great established figures of theatrical creativity. Along comes Euripides. And he wrote nearly 100 plays. We've got more of his than anybody else. There are nearly 20 still extant. And he became, because of the quality of his writing, because of the nature and sometimes the topics of his writing, but certainly the quality of his writing, after Aeschylus and Sophocles had gone, he was still there. And he became, if you like, I wouldn't say the poet laureate or the state poet, but he became highly regarded. And as time passed, his writings were read more and became, like the compulsory text to read in school, that kind of thing. But his invention or his influence, his innovations, really were to do with the representation of these traditional characters, these historic or mythological characters, such as Agamemnon, such as Oedipus, but representing them much more as ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. I'm quoting there. And for those of you who've heard me talk about Shakespeare, you'll recognize that thought. The genius of Shakespeare was to take historic characters and not make a king, but make a king a person who happened to be a king, so that he would examine that person not through his kingship, but through his humanity or lack of it. That wasn't just original thinking on the part of Shakespeare. That was Shakespeare being a damn good reader, because this was the thematic behind Euripides' writing. His characters were, dare I say, infinitely more human. And that writing, that notion, even though the others, Aeschylus and Sophocles, had introduced comedic aspects to their tragedy, the way Euripides wrote opened up that door. It broke another rule and opened up the door for the absurdity, not merely the tragedy of the human condition, but the absurdity of the human condition. He was, if Sophocles had opened the door of the inner humanity of a character, Euripides tore it off its hinges and just let everything out. And because of him, because of what Euripides did with theatre, we get the inner turmoil of characters of noble and authoritative rank. So you would say Othello was a general, a figure of authority and rank. We don't look at that. What we look at is the human turmoil in Othello's soul as an older man of a different race in love with the wrong woman who loves him back, and then experiences that most dreadful of all human frailty, jealousy. That's Euripidean. And you'll find that in so much modern writing, right into the 20th century. The quote I'm making would be, imprisoned men and women destroy each other by the intensity of their loves and hates. Not because of politics, not because of faith, but because of love and hate. They destroy each other. Human basic emotions, regardless of rank, regardless of position. There's, that old notion of God's in his heaven, the king's on his throne, and all's right with the world. Well, it isn't, because the king is a human being, the king or queen. So through that, because he is demonstrating not merely the tragedy of the human condition, but the absurdity of the human condition, you might say that he was the beginning of, within the realm of tragedy, that marrying of the two masks, that comedy and tragedy go hand in hand, because no matter what we do, there is an absurd element to it. And to my mind, the greatest demonstration of that is from Shakespeare, which is King Lear, which, when you look upon it, is the most grotesquely, absurdly funny tragedy ever written. Everything that can go wrong does go wrong. It's almost a comedy. So Euripides, I'm shooting through my notes because I'm talking too much. Euripides, in a sense, created, out of the rules that Aeschylus and Sophocles had already broken, he smashed them. He smashed through them. And some of his plays are so modern, so unbelievably modern. When you read them, you sort of think that 2,500 years can't possibly be. You look at Phaedra, you look at Hippolytus. These are remarkable plays about people that we can recognize today. He wrote about people who are in the newspaper, people that are on the news. He wrote about them because people don't change. One thing Euripides did do, Sophocles, when he was writing, would set up a situation through dialogue. Euripides tended to do it through a monologue, through a basic, okay, here we are, this is what's happening, and these are these people. So he wanted the audience to know right from the beginning, no questions, who is who, what is what, where is where. A very efficient way of doing it. But of all the writers, I think he would be the most recognized as a modern playwright. He had this capacity to be comedic. I don't mean writing comedy, but to be comedic, to point out the absurdities, the silliness of human behavior, as well as the tragedy of it. He used characters that the audience would recognize, or at least took the historic characters and turned them into people that the audience would immediately recognize from their everyday lives. And he also used a much more, they tell me, I don't read ancient Greek, but they tell me he used a much more vernacular form of Greek, an everyday language, rather than the heightened language that Aeschylus and Sophocles might have used. And again, I'm quoting a quote I found. It was Euripides, not Aeschylus and Sophocles, whose tragic muse presided over the birth of, or the rebirth of tragedy in Renaissance Europe. That when in the Renaissance they started looking back at the ancient Greek writers, it was to Euripides that they first went, because they could recognize his characters more readily. Then we come to the fourth. And the fourth writer in this group, if Aeschylus was the father of tragedy, it is fair to say that Aristophanes was the father of comedy. Again, it is estimated that he wrote around 40 plays. 11 of them survive, which is not bad, not as many as Euripides, but pretty good. And there's a term for this, for the kind of plays that he wrote, which has become known as old comedy. Old comedy and new comedy. There is a distinct difference, and you'll recognize them because they still exist. It is, again, Aristophanes' genius was to basically put on stage the life that people knew around them. He was showing them themselves. He was showing them their absurdities. And the characters that he wrote, you could meet on the street. He had a wonderful ability to ridicule everything that was going on around him politically. Now, at the time, Athens was what we would now describe as a populist republic. He didn't like it. He didn't like government. He didn't like the way people behaved. He didn't like the absurdity and stupidity. But he understood that the best way to oppose things you don't like is to ridicule them. Satire. It's a thing that, dare I say, if he were writing today, he'd be on the Saturday Night Live team. He would be, although he was far from being what we would call left-wing, but it was by satire, by pointing out the absurdity of everyday people on the street, and how stupid they were, that created some of the earliest and most brilliant forms of the old comedy. And nobody was safe. Nobody was sacred, be it, kings, princes, and even philosophers. He would, the leader of Athens, Cleon, was savagely attacked by Aristophanes. It is said that he, because of his satires, because of his comedies, he actually contributed to the ultimate death of Socrates, because he satirized everyone. He made everyone appear absurd. wrote his plays, he acted in his plays, he directed his plays. One of my favorite quotes from him: "The author-director of comedies has the hardest job of all." Well, that hasn't changed in 2,500 years, I can tell you. We don't know an awful lot about his own background, but we know an awful lot about his plays. That he, again, had broken the rules. And in fact created a whole new rule book in the writing of comedy, which had started as gentle satires, but he had brought it down to a very common level. Common, I mean, in the level of ordinary people. He always thought he was writing for the intelligentsia, but by so doing, I mean, he was caricaturing anybody in any position of power and authority. There's a quote I'm looking for. Oh yes, the other important thing that we would recognize today in modern American theater, in the creation of these productions, one always had to have a chorus, and they were quite expensive. And they invented a concept whereby initially it was almost like a priestly function to build the chorus and pay for it. He introduced the idea that big businessmen could actually make contributions and maybe even appear in the chorus themselves if they paid for it. It was an early form of artistic donation. Now, I mentioned the fact that tragedy as a word comes from the Greek words for goat song, on the basis that it was assumed that a goat was sacrificed at the beginning of the religious aspect of the ceremony. The word for comedy comes from the Greeks' words for revel and song. In other words, fun song or dance song or what have you. And dance was an equally important aspect of many of these productions. And so the old comedy did follow a kind of a rule book. And there was, I mentioned the fact that there was old comedy, which was Aristophanes, and new comedy. The new comedy was about somewhat more realistic plots. It was simpler and softer. I would use the notion that new comedy came closer to what we would understand as farce, and old comedy what we would understand as satire. So in Aristophanic comedy, the hero is decent, ordinary bloke, smart, clever, intelligent, and suddenly finds himself in an absolutely appalling and impossible situation. So how that occurs, how that happens, is the same fundamental element as tragedy. And as I was talking about, when we were talking about As You Like It a few weeks back, As You Like It as a play starts in such a way that it could become a tragedy, but it turns into a comedy. This is true of this notion of the comedy from Aristophanes, that you start off with something that could begin either way. Nice, decent person, impossible situation, everything that could go wrong does. How does he get out of it? And that's the element of the comedy, the absurdity, the absurd behaviors. And he followed a very strict set of rules, some of which still exist today. You would begin the play with a prologue or an introduction of who's who, what's what. Then you'd have the chorus come on, which would be the crowd scene suddenly happens, and in the Greek sense, dancing and singing and interaction with the main characters. Sounds a bit like Oklahoma. You have a series of scenes in which the plot begins to unfold itself. And these tend to be, you have a good scene, a bad scene, a good scene, a bad scene, a good scene, a bad scene. I mean, in terms of the action within it, not the quality of the writing. You have the eventual point where everything is beginning to be explained, ways through are happening. And at the end, everything seems to come together into a conclusion that is both absurd and logical and crazy and satisfactory, and all the chorus dance and sing the song and go off. This is, and I mentioned Oklahoma, but it's not entirely different to the construction of the modern musical. Now, all right, enough about these guys. The fact that Aristophanes' plays were not just performed, but started to circulate as manuscripts as well, was a very important development. People like to read them. They became a kind of like a library of commentary on socio-political activity in his time that people could read and see the stupidity of and see the absurdity of. I sort of like to think that the fact that he was being published, that people were reading his works as much as performing his works, began the concept of the novel in a way, that people could assess what went before in the next generation and the following generations. But the artistic influence of Aristophanes, like Euripides and indeed Sophocles and Aeschylus before them, really did build the groundwork for what eventually, and it wasn't a steady process, it wasn't an easy process, but put the groundwork in because they were constantly being rediscovered. The Romans rediscovered them. Renaissance Italy and France rediscovered them. And they are rediscovered constantly in just about every new cycle of theatre. Beckett rediscovered, Shakespeare rediscovered them. Their influence on European theatre, Western theatre, is absolute. They are the building blocks. They are the foundation, and particularly these four. And these four, not simply because they were the best, but because they are the ones that we only they do we have a relatively sizable chunk of writing that has come down to us. There may have been others, but sadly we will never know. But the influence they had all the way through, and you can see it in Shakespeare, you can see it, somebody pointed out, and I'm going to be discussing next week, Gilbert and Sullivan were influenced by Aristophanes and by the craziness of it. The topsy-turvy world of Gilbert and Sullivan is pure Aristophanes. And an important quote, and I'm going to, next week, I'm going to be talking about these influences, the way the Greeks have influenced writers down through the last 2,500 years. Briefly, I can't cover everything that happened in 2,500 years, but I want to talk about those influences and the writers and how those influences have worked. One of the important point, and it's a lovely quote, and I'm not sure where I found this quote, but it is a perfect quote about the nature of writing, of acting, of human communication. And it is simply, by words, the mind is winged. Once you have the capacity to speak words and to formulate them to describe the tragedy and the absurdity of human existence, those words will take wing, no matter how much book burning you do or library clearing. Anyway, next week we will talk about the influences. And we'll take a little look at 2,500 years of playwriting. In the meantime, a couple of tiny notices. For those of you in the Pittsburgh region, our gala will be happening in March. There's the notice. And we hope you'll join us there. It's very reasonably priced. It's going to be a lovely evening, and the view from that place is spectacular. So we do hope that you'll check online on the website and book tickets to come to the gala. It will be very COVID safe, and we're going to have a lovely evening. And I can say hello to you all. Now, the reservations for our next Expand the Canon series reading are now open. It's called Rachel. It's going to be on in 2 weeks' time. We are going back to live reading. We had to do one on Zoom, the last one, but we're back to live performance of this. There will be two performances on the day. It's completely free of charge, but you do have to let us know you're coming because we have a restricted number of seats, and we want to make sure that when you come, you're let in, that there is a seat ready for you to sit in. So do please go to the website. If you can make a donation, please do. As I say, right now we are open for sponsorship of these webinars, but any other donation, please let us, no matter how small, it matters. Every single donation matters, and it is the donations that pay for productions. Thank you all for being there. Thank you all for your support. Thank you all for sticking with us through these terrible times, and I hope the weather holds and that wherever you are, you're having a lovely spring day as well. See you all next week. Bye.